I've started a new Bluebell painting. This painting is 100 by 100 centimetres square. And what I'm doing here is I'm building up an underpainting with acrylic using a large brush. And the reason for that is to create this surface over which to work with the oils. I like to use some strong colour and build up the textures of the paint. So I have quite a few layers in this underpainting. And you can see there's quite a contrast of tones as well. So I'm putting lots of darks in, especially. I really like to have some good dark tones in fairly early on in the painting. And this is lovely Bluebell Woods, and that's a perfect subject for creating a colourful textural painting in oils. So I've got the basic composition set out here and a lot of interesting colour and texture over which I can work with the oils. And now you see I've switched to oils, but the painting was dry. This is the following day. And I'm using a palette knife, quite a large palette knife, so I can get a lot of paint on the knife. And I'm starting with this area of light sky colour at the top, where there's, in the photo that I took, there was a lot of light coming through. And in a way, I have to work on these sort of background colours before I can bring in the foreground, because once I've got the oil paint on, you can paint over, but it's easier to kind of think of layers of paint. I'm using the palette knife in such a way as I'm sort of dragging the paint over at this stage, so that some of that underpainting will show through a little bit. I'm not worrying too much about being detailed or anything. I just want to get this light tone in and building up these layers of paint. This video I took and I've sped it up a bit. In fact, I made a mistake. It was going to be a time-lapse video, but I think I must have pressed the wrong button. So some of it might be a bit quicker and some of it a bit slower, but I thought that was a good opportunity to try out having a chat about the painting over the video. I thought I'd try talking about it as I go. So I'm working across the painting, looking at the light colours, and this is really just the first layer. So there'll be other colours going on the top of that. And I try to keep working over the painting fairly evenly. I try not to get bogged down in one particular area. So, I won't sort of work in one corner and get that finished and then move on. I try to see the tones and layers as an overall thing and gradually build it up throughout the painting. And what I was doing there was just sort of using a tissue to just sort of merge some bits and sort of soften some areas. And I've changed colour. I've got a sort of a light, very pale yellow here. So I'm picking up a little bit of the lighter colours between the trees now. And so sort of as I mix the paint as I go, and often I'll add a colour onto a colour that I've already mixed, so it gets quite complex really, the mixing of the colour. And you can see I'm sort of working across and down the painting. A lot of this will get covered up later on, but it's just about creating these layers of colour and texture. So you can see that some of the colours from underneath are showing through, and a lot of the texture is just been sort of added to, really. So you get these sort of lots of lovely textures. And some of the paint goes on very thinly and some of it goes on much thicker. When I'm using oils, I'll use an impasto medium, which helps to dry the oils because I'm using quite a lot of paint, and as I said, some areas are quite thick, so it would take weeks and weeks to dry if I didn't use a fast drying medium. So it has to be an impasto medium because I want the paint to be lovely and thick. So you don't want one that's too liquid that's going to make it more fluid. You want something that's going to keep the body of the paint. And I try to mix that in as I go when I mix the colours, and that really helps to dry the paint a bit quicker. I wouldn't say it's dry within hours or days. It might take a couple of weeks for it to be dry enough, I would think, to sort of frame up and send out to a gallery, at least a couple of weeks. So obviously it kind of depends on how much medium you've mixed in. It's not a science, it's just something that I try to remember to add in as I mix the colours. So I find that very helpful, and it extends the paint a little bit as well. So if you do like using impasto oils, then it's worth getting some of this medium. Now I've got a slightly different colour now. I'm using a softish green. I really enjoy mixing different greens and different shades and tones of these colours, and I'll find I mix a colour and then I'll be adding different reds or purples into that to kind of subtly change the colours. So there'll be lots of nuances of colour throughout the painting, as well as having these layers. And what I'm doing now, these little gaps, is I'm mixing the colour. So when I go off like that, I'm mixing a bit of colour, getting more on the knife, and so that the knife's well loaded with paint. And then I can go in and I'm sort of there. Now what I'm doing now is I've got this sort of soft reddish sort of lightish brown, and I'm just starting to bring in some of the tree trunks. Obviously some of them were hinted at in the underpainting, but at this point I'm adding them with the oils, and kind of looking to see where I want them to come. So that's sort of partly going over some of these lighter colours that I've put down with the oils. I think with this sort of painting the trees, it's quite a pale colour there that I'm putting in. So I've got a variety of tones, and as you'll find that with the woodland scene, some of the trees that are further away will appear lighter in tone, and obviously the ones that are in the foreground perhaps a bit darker and a bit more contrast. Sometimes they'll be very light because of the sun, but in this particular painting they're kind of a little bit darker at the moment, and we'll see how it progresses. And with the photo, you don't have to stick religiously to a photograph. You can kind of change it slightly just to emphasise the depth, and you don't have to be a slave to the photo. So I try to sort of, and the more I've done over the years, the more I've got used to sort of kind of adapting the work as I go to make it work as a painting. And I think that's the key, is to practice, do lots of work, and then you'll get used to building up your experience and how a painting will work. It's very complex. You've got a lot of different aspects that you've got to think about. Now I've got a lovely green here, quite pale, and I'm putting in, it's kind of like a horizontal-ish sort of area that's going across behind the trees. That's some of the sort of grassy areas where the light's catching it. And that's kind of helping with the composition a bit, because it's given me a bit of a focus there on that horizontal. Not a straight line, but something with a bit of interest. It goes up and down a bit, and also it's bringing a bit more light and a bit of definition into the painting. And there are areas where I'm sort of being very free with it. I'm trying not to get too detailed. And this is my approach, really, is to, as much as I can, try and keep it free and build up these areas of colour. And I'm working between these sort of bold tree trunk shapes, which I haven't really, the foreground ones I haven't really got any oils on at this point. So I'm trying to get this background colour in and building up the light at the moment. So I find that having the texture underneath really helps, because it creates an unexpected surface over which to work. So that is one way of helping me to keep it very free and very fresh. And over the years I've found ways of doing that with different techniques. And especially on these larger paintings, I like to have a lot of texture. Now I'm now going in with some darker colours to get some of the tree trunks in with the oils. And I go back to different areas as I work through it. So at this point that's looking quite dark, but I might go back and put a lighter colour on as well. And you can work over a bit with the oils. You have to be very direct and not mess about with it too much. I try not to sort of blend the colours too much on the actual canvas. I'd rather go in with a nice big juicy kind of lot of paint and put that down and leave it alone as much as possible. So I'm referring to the photo and trying to get a little idea of just the way the trees are sort of shapes, and the way they kind of they're not quite straight, they're just slightly curved, and that sort of thing. Little details like that, although it doesn't have to be exact. It's nice to get a feel for the trees and other elements within it. And I can add in, not every element will have been there in the underpainting. Here I'm adding in another area of a tree trunk which wasn't really there very much before, and that's kind of coming across and behind the others. And you can see it's slightly lighter tone than the previous one that I was working on, and building up some of the sort of branches and things like that. So I'm gradually building up these different layers, and trying not to get too engrossed in one particular part of the painting. I think that's a good point to remember, is to sort of move around the painting so that you're not getting fixed on one thing, and that way the work will it will gradually appear as a whole rather than be too overworked. I like to think that I'm just sort of putting in what needs to be there rather than putting in everything in the photo. So I'm still working on the tree trunks, trying to get different tones in, really, and I think that's quite important, trying to build up these different the depth, really, with these different colours, different tones of colour, and different colours too, because the light will bounce off the trees. They're not all exactly the same. They've got different sort of reflected light and shadows and things. So they're not just one colour. There's different colours even within the sort of tree trunks. So I think that's good to sort of really try and sort of give this sort of variety, it will help with the depth of the painting. And I'm actually putting some quite light tones. I think they were birches, so they've got this sort of lovely bark which catches the light, and that's a lovely soft sort of colour that you can get sometimes with these birch trees, and works really well with the bluebells. So I'm still building up the tree trunks, and as well as the colour, I'm also using quite a lot of paint on these areas, because that's really going to help to describe the kind of solidity of the tree trunk. Obviously they're really solid, they're not flat, so, and the textures. So by using nice lot of paint, that will really make them stand out against the background. So I'm trying to sort of, here I go again with the background. So I'm kind of switching between the tree trunks and the sort of shapes between, lightening up some of that, because everything's related to each other. So to get the tree trunk to stand out, you've got to do the area around it. It's the negative shape, really. So you're looking at how the colours and the tones and the shapes relate. And I'm working on the bottom area of the painting. At this point, I'm trying to sort of get a background colour in. It's not really, really dark, and it's not really light. It's got quite a mid-tone. So I'm mixing a softish, neutral sort of green that will act as a sort of background to all the other colours that are going to go in, other greens and the bluebells, of course. So it's quite nice to have this sort of neutral colour. And obviously I'd done quite a lot to the top half of the painting, so I really needed to work on the lower half so that it equally. So I'm trying to build this up now before I then go back into working on the top half again. And you can see I'm leaving some of the colours coming through from underneath, and building up a lot of texture so that it's going to create this lovely surface on the canvas. Working quite quickly, not looking at detail, just getting that kind of mid-tone colour down as much as I can. And it's going to give a contrast to the light that's in the background as well. And so I've covered quite a big area. And now I've kind of got the whole painting a bit more moving on together more, so it's easier to see the relationship between the darks and the lights if you work on the whole thing. And I can stand back and have a look and just see now where I need to bring in lighter colours and more texture, so I can bring in some lighter areas within that foreground. Start to sort of build this up with some lighter greens. I like working with a palette knife because it allows me to mix these colours and keep them very fresh. With a brush, it's much more difficult to keep a clean brush and to keep the colours fresh. And I can use lots of paint and get these lovely areas of thick paint with the palette knife. And the more you use a tool like that, the more you get used to it and the more you know how it's going to work. And I'm using quite a large one at the moment, really so that I don't get too fiddly with it and get too bogged down with detail. And I'm gradually building up on top of these colours now with some more tones of greens. And, I'll be working over the painting a lot with different tones. So trying to sort of identify. And as I'm working with these sort of background negative shapes, I'm also thinking about the shapes of the trees, because that's how I'm creating those shapes, is by working between them as well as actually on the tree trunks themselves. And so at this point really I've created a base now over which I can start to put more light in. And obviously here I go with the tree trunk again, building it up, working across the tree trunk. That I find helps to create a kind of a more three-dimensional feel. And I don't want too much of a sharp edge, because it's a round three-dimensional thing, so I'm trying to create a softer edge. And obviously they're not like telegraph poles, they are tree trunks, so they've got kind of character and little nooks and crannies within them. So bringing some darks down into the lower area, creating some shadows, that's just really going to help to kind of anchor the tree trunks to the ground, and it will provide a nice dark tone over which I can add in some of the areas of light. You need these contrasts of tone and light, of dark and light. Here I'm really getting in with a slightly lighter colour, which is giving me a lovely texture on that birch tree. I love the way the different areas of tone are sort of building up, creating that 3D tree trunk. And so you've got darks and lights within it, and that's just really helping to show that sort of lovely colour and texture of the birch tree, and picking out little areas of dark and a bit of light. Not too much light, because it's against the light really behind it, but there's a bit of, I wanted a little bit of nuance in that tone. I didn't want it to be too black against the background, and really wanted to make like the tree trunk have it a little bit of presence there and not get too black and silhouetted really. So I'm still bringing in bits of dark detail into some of these trees, because then I can start to add in some more foliage and some more light. Here I am still putting in, there's a thinner tree, well that's going to appear further back. So all these kind of things help to create depth. So putting in different kind of thickness of tree trunk will create this feeling of depth that you get in the woods, and building up the dark shapes. You can see that I'm using the photograph as a reference, and really with the photograph it's about sort of picking out key elements that you want to put in your work. Don't have to put every leaf and every tree trunk, but there'll be certain elements that are important for the painting, and I suppose that is the art. It is selection, really. Here I've got a little bit of light colour. I'm just picking out a few areas, lighter areas on those tree trunks. It's always good to stand back and have a good look at the work, especially with these large pieces. You have to really. So even within that one tree trunk at the front, I've got quite a few different tones and colours. That's really creating that 3D effect and really standing out. And it's really going to add to the finished painting. There we go, back to the light colour now. So it's this switching from darks to lights so that you're adjusting the relationships of the tones. So sometimes you'll get a colour and then you'll think, oh, I need to lighten that area up for that to work. So you can put a colour down, and like I did the very first colour I put down, the kind of sky colour, I'm now adjusting that slightly with a lighter colour. I'm not completely obliterating it, but I'm just adding to a lighter tone. And that's the thing, it's all the time assessing what you need to make the painting work. So I'm going in, I'm picking out some of the pale colours of some of the bluebells that are lighter in colour. So I'm gradually building up the areas and mixing the colour as much as possible to reflect the colour of the bluebells. So it's not just one colour, there's lots of different tones where the light catches it, and building that up throughout the painting so you create the depth as well. And obviously where it's lighter, it's gonna go back a bit now. I've got the lighter areas at the back of the painting, but also here I am putting some quite sort of deep tones, purpley blues, not putting obviously each individual flower, but really creating texture that helps to describe it. So it's kind of areas of colour rather than thinking of the individual flowers. I'm just trying to sort of build up this texture, which is a kind of impressionistic way, I suppose, of painting. So I'm not going to concentrate on getting a particular shape or anything. I'm just building up that colour and texture and different tones. So at this point, I'm probably mixing up lots of paint. It goes a bit. Here I come. What have I got? Oh, I'm putting in some dark and also some sort of sharper lines as well. Adding some different texture with the edge of the palette knife with some darker tones of paint. It's all helping to create the appearance of this foliage in the foreground and building up this lovely texture. You can see it's just a darker tone going in. So the original sort of greens I put down was a mid-tint tone, so this is a slightly darker one. And that's going to be useful to have those tones underneath when I put lighter colours over it. Sometimes when I'm working on a painting like this, I get to a point when I think, oh, it's looking a bit dull, there's not enough interest in it. But you have to get all this groundwork done, if you like, before you can then go in with putting the light in, really, putting that little bit of sparkle in, really towards the end of the painting. That's when it gets more exciting. And all this sort of work of building up the background and the texture and the kind of mid and dark tones, it sort of, it's all part of it, but it just, it doesn't really sort of all come together until the last few areas of the painting. So it's got a slightly lighter green now, so you can see just beginning to bring in some light, a little bit of light in the foreground. I obviously don't want to get too much because the light is sort of further back and this foreground area is a bit darker, more shadowy. And I think there's quite a lot more to do to the top area as well. There's little flecks of light coming through, and you can see how that's starting to show. That's because I've got those darks underneath. And without the darks, you're not going to get the lights to stand out. So even if it's just a small amount of light, that will really stand out more if you've got that darker tone underneath. And what I'm doing is I'm picking up the textures to create these areas of light. I'm just dragging the palette knife over the paint and it's just picking up texture. I suppose it's partly really getting to know how you can create these textures. And that's down to practice. It's like anything really. It's really having a go and doing as much as you can. And then you get to know how to create the right textures, the right colours and the tones and everything, and then it will all come together. It takes a lot of work to get that experience. So there's a bit of light coming in the foreground. So I suppose it's really judging how much dark and light that there needs to be. You don't want to lose the sort of shadowy feel of the woods, but you want to bring up that texture and start to bring in a bit of light here and there. Just being quite specific here, because it is the foreground and you want it to come forward, so you need a certain amount of detail really. It looks like I'm putting in some very thin kind of branches, and having that patch of light behind there is really helping for that to stand out. All that will have been in the photograph, this sort of light little patch of green and then the darker branches, and obviously then I can go in up here with some as well. So it helps at the top having the obviously the light down fairly early on, that light area, and then you can build on top of that. You know, sometimes I think, oh, I've neglected that area of the painting. I need to get over there. And this is sort of one bit where I'm bringing these branches that are coming across, and I think that really helps with depth as well. It kind of, and it creates extra space and spaces and interest as well. It's really, I love painting woods and trees. It's just one of my favourite subjects because you've got so much texture there and depth as well. And you can create lovely light. You know, anyone that's walked through the woods, it's the light that's so fascinating, really. I'm obviously mixing up a new colour. That's why it takes a little while. And we'll see what it's going to be next. Obviously quite a complicated colour, as I'm spending quite a while mixing it up. I think I've got quite a lot more to do to the top area. Oh, here I go. You see now I'm building up a bit of foliage. I've obviously been mixing up a green, and now I can build up this area. I thought that was a long time mixing paint, so I was obviously trying to work out what colour. That's sort of not a dark green, not a particularly pale green, but a kind of middle green. But it's light enough to just add a bit of contrast over that tree trunk, and dark enough also to show up against the light background. So it's kind of this mid-tone, which is working really well with both areas, the dark of the tree trunk and the light of the background. And I think over the next part of the painting I'll be adding quite a bit more to the top half and getting those greens and the light in a bit more. And by bringing the foliage in front of the tree trunk, that's creating depth as well. All these layers create depth. And I'm not trying to particularly get a certain leaf shape or anything. Sometimes I will try and hint at it, but a little bit there perhaps, but not overly detailed. I just want to get this effect of the foliage in a quite impressionist sort of way. And that's starting to bring the painting to life now. This is really where it starts to get more fun, I suppose. I've done a lot of groundwork, and now I'm adding a bit more interest and adding this sort of layer, which is really coming closer to the end of the painting. It all starts to sort of fall into place, really. A lot of mixing of the colours to get different greens. I'll mix a colour up. I don't really use earthy colours. I use quite sort of basic colours, and I'll mix. The only green I have is Viridian, which I always mix colours with to create different greens. And I'll add even sort of purples and reds to that to create these different greens, as well as sort of lighter yellows and whites. So it's it's a real sort of I suppose complicated mix of colour. I never ever use a colour straight from the tube. I've always mixed something with it to create my own colour. Still think it's still building up this foliage, and this is going to go on for a bit now, which is the fun bit. I like this bit actually. It really is much more interesting. It seems that sometimes, especially this is quite a big painting. Well, it's a metre square, so it is a big painting. So there's a lot of paint to actually physically get on the canvas. So it's quite physical work. So you're using a lot of energy, just covering the canvas with paint. And you can see I'm walking back and forth from the palette and sort of, looking at what I'm doing. And so it's quite, you need quite a lot of energy, and I like to feel that my paintings have got a bit of energy to them. So it's really, it's about bringing that movement and energy into work. You can see I've got a lighter colour here, so I'm going in front of some of those tree trunks. That will really help to create the depth now. And I'm using different strokes of the palette knife. Sometimes I want tiny little bits of paint, and sometimes I'll have bigger areas of paint. Almost sometimes just little dots of light, and that's really the most effective thing against the dark. It just gives a little bit of sparkle. Because this time of year, the trees are, they're not fully out, really, the leaves. Most of them are coming out, so there's not sort of masses and masses of dark greens. It's quite, and some of the greens are very pale as well, and almost sort of yellows and oranges you get in the colours of the leaves. It's a lovely time of year because it's not too green as such, and that really sort of brings, again, more interest into it because there's so many different colours, really. And of course, autumn is one of my favourite. Well, it's probably my most favourite time of year, really, for woodland paintings. The colours can be fantastic. So, but spring is lovely. It's very fresh. Trying to bring that freshness to the painting. It's about a feeling. It's about creating an atmosphere, a feeling. And in the work, it's not about copying a photo or describing a specific place. It's about creating the feeling that you get when you have a walk in the woods and you see a view like this. And that's what I'm hoping to do in the painting. So now I've got some darker tone green which I'm putting in, and that's sort of, it's not one tone of green, there's lots of different tones. So I've got a mid-tone and a darker tone now coming in. It's all going to help to create that depth. It's about contrast of colour, contrast of tone, contrast of texture. So you've got areas that are heavily painted on and others that are a lot thinner. So there's all these different contrasts in the painting which create the interest. Light and dark, thick and thin, warm and cold, I suppose, with the different colours. I like to get quite a lot of warmth You'll notice in the underpainting there were quite a few oranges and reds, which I like to have, especially if you're doing something like this where you've got a lot of greens and blues, which can be quite cool. It's nice to have a bit of warmth coming through, so there's still a little bit of the red coming through in the tree trunk, for instance, and that I think just helps to balance with some of the cooler colours. So now you see I've gone back down to the bottom area a little bit. I'm trying to see the painting as a whole, trying not to sort of get too engrossed in one area. So sometimes I'll notice, or I'll bring a colour that I'm using in one area, for instance in the foliage, and then I'll think, well, I want to bring a bit of that colour down here, and that all helps to bring the painting together as a whole. Just adding tiny little bits of light here. As I said, it's about bringing a little bit of sparkle to it, just picking up little bits of light. So I've been painting a long time. I've been painting, since I was a child, but over 50 years really. And a lot of that time painting as a profession. So I suppose it's a lot of practice. I've really enjoyed working on these larger pieces in recent years, and I think it's made me, it's kind of made me realise perhaps that I should have done it a bit earlier. It gives you more scope for using texture and colour. It really gives you a lot of freedom, which I really like. Perhaps I'll do an even bigger one day. I do slightly bigger than this, but it'd be nice to do something really big. But then it'd take a lot of energy. And here I'm getting in, really bringing in these areas of very pale, a little bit yellow-green with a lot of white in it. And it's probably quite thick paint that I'm using, which is really going to just bring that forward and make that, give it that depth. Must be mixing a colour up, I think, at this point. Yeah, I am. Yes, I think I've got a sort of a bluebell colour, a light, where the bluebell's perhaps been caught by a bit of light, and just add in some little bits of light into it. Just bring a bit of detail into the foreground. Not too much. You just want to do enough to describe what's there, not overdo it. I'm obviously working out how to get the right blue. I think I've got a darker blue there, because the Bluebell Woods, I mean, it's extraordinary really, because it's kind of blue, but there's sort of blues and purples and pinks and almost white. You know, it's sort of such an interesting thing really to sort of actually try and represent it. You don't want to just mix up one colour blue and do it all the same. Oh, I must have put it onto a faster speed. I don't know what happened when I was taking the video. It seemed to go fast and slow for some reason. Anyway, I'm really bringing those bluebells forward a bit more now. A lot of thinking time at this stage, because you've really got to decide how much to do, how much more to put in. You know, you need to sort of look and sort of really sort of make decisions about you know, what you need to leave out and if you need to put any more interest in. I think it's nearly finished. I think these paintings, they do tend to be very full and very lush, but I think it's really the subject matter is so full, really. There's so much texture, there's so much light and colour that they have to be like that, really. I'm just standing back looking at it, I think, and just assessing what I've done and if there's anything I need to add. You know, anything that needs taking out or putting in. There's a little bit of detail there. Sometimes it might just be slightly bit dark tone to bring out the light a bit more. That's what I'm doing there, just slightly adjusting the tone of that. And some of these, I've put some light in now, I'm just bringing a few darks in to just accentuate that a little bit. It's all quite subtle, really. They're bold paintings, but there's a lot of subtle decisions made about the darks and lights and the colours. Well, I think it's nearly done. This must be nearly the end. Well, I hope you've enjoyed watching me work. And, yeah. Thanks for watching.